When did my roommate's house rules finally backfire on her? My roommate Jenna had this system where she created new house rules every week, but they only applied to me. She'd type them up and tape them to the refrigerator with my name at the top. Kitchen closes at 8 p.m. for deep cleaning. Tara cannot use the kitchen after 8. But she'd be in there making elaborate dinners at midnight. When I pointed out the double standard, she'd say, "I don't make messes like you do. This rule exists because of your behavior, not mine." She controlled everything. The thermostat could only be adjusted by her because I apparently didn't understand energy efficiency. The washing machine was off limits on weekends because those were her laundry days. I couldn't have guests over without 48 hours written notice submitted through email, but her boyfriend basically lived there rent-free. "He's not a guest. He's my emotional support," she'd say. The bathroom schedule was the worst. She decided I could only shower between 6 and 6:30 a.m. because any other time interfered with her routine. If I tried to shower at any other time, she'd turn off the hot water heater. Rules exist for a reason, Tara. This is about mutual respect. But she'd take 2-hour baths whenever she felt like it. She installed a lock on the kitchen cabinets where she kept the good food. I had one shelf in the fridge and one cabinet for my stuff. Everything else was hers. When my mom sent me homemade cookies, Jenna ate them all and said, "You left them on the counter, that's communal space. You should have put them in your designated area." But when I accidentally used her milk, she threatened to call the police for theft. The living room was basically her second bedroom. She'd spread out her work stuff everywhere and declare it a quiet zone when she was studying. But when I needed to study, she'd have movie nights with friends. "You can study in your room. I pay for half this apartment. I can use the common areas." She'd change the Wi-Fi password without telling me because I was apparently using too much bandwidth. Then she'd give me the wrong password on purpose and pretend it was a typo. I'd miss assignment deadlines because I couldn't get online. "You should have double-checked the password," she'd say. Personal responsibility is important. She started fining me for violations of her rules. $5 if I left a dish in the sink for more than an hour. $10 if I forgot to lock the door even though she constantly left it wide open. $20 if my alarm woke her up, but her phone calls at 3 a.m. were fine because some people have international friends. She kept a notebook documenting every perceived infraction. This went on for 2 years because breaking the lease would cost me thousands I didn't have. Jenna had me convinced that no other roommate situation would be better. "You're lucky I'm so organized and clear about expectations. Most people would just kick you out." She'd tell our mutual friends that I was impossible to live with, that she had to create structure because I was so chaotic. Then came senior year, when Jenna decided to run for student housing president. She campaigned on being the most responsible, fair, and organized candidate. She used our apartment as an example of her leadership skills. I've successfully managed a difficult roommate situation through clear communication and structured rules. She invited the housing committee to our apartment for a meeting to show them her system. The color-coded charts, the typed rules, and the violation notebook. She presented it all like she was some kind of genius. "This is how you create harmony in shared spaces," she said, pointing at her 43-page roommate handbook she'd created. That's when I decided to apply for the same position. Jenna laughed when she found out. "You can't even follow basic apartment rules. How could you manage student housing?" The debate was held in front of the entire student government. Jenna went first, talking about her innovative approach to conflict resolution and her proven track record of maintaining harmonious living situations. She actually brought her roommate's handbook as evidence of her capabilities. When it was my turn, I pulled out my own documentation. 2 years of photos, receipts, and recordings. "I'd like to share my experience with Jenna's management style," I said. I showed them the picture of the thermostat locked in a plastic box that only Jenna had the key to. The photo of me sleeping on the couch was taken because she'd declared my bedroom a storage area for her semester project without asking. The receipts for all the illegal fines she'd charged me. The recording of her admitting she deliberately gave me the wrong Wi-Fi passwords to sabotage my grades. The committee asked Jenna if this was true. She tried to explain that I needed structure, that I was chaotic, that her rules were reasonable. "Let's review these reasonable rules," I said, reading from her handbook. Rule number 17. Bathroom usage restricted to a 30-minute window between 6 and 6:30 a.m. Violators subject to hot water suspension. The room went completely silent. I looked up from the handbook and saw every single committee member staring at Jenna with faces that showed they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Some of them had their mouths slightly open, others were shaking their heads slowly. Jenna's face turned bright red and she shifted in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests so hard her knuckles went white. She knew this wasn't going the way she planned. Jenna cleared her throat and sat up straighter, trying to look confident again. She explained that structure was necessary when you lived with someone who lacked basic organizational skills. Her voice came out defensive instead of calm like before. She kept glancing at the committee members, trying to make eye contact, but most of them were looking down at their notes or at me. Griffin leaned forward and asked her to clarify why the rules only applied to me and not to her. Jenna stammered for a second, then said something about different standards for different people based on demonstrated responsibility. A couple of committee members exchanged looks with each other. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photo I took last month. I held it up so everyone could see the thermostat locked inside a clear plastic box with a padlock on it. The committee members leaned forward to look at the screen. Layla asked why this level of control was necessary. I explained that Jenna claimed I didn't understand energy efficiency, but really she just wanted complete control over our apartment temperature. I told them how she kept it at 62 degrees all winter, and I had to sleep in a hoodie and 2 blankets. Jenna tried to interrupt, but Griffin held up his hand to stop her. The committee started firing questions at Jenna one after another. They asked about specific rules and why she thought they were reasonable. Jenna kept trying to frame everything as reasonable responses to my behavior. She used words like accountability and mutual respect and living standards. But when they asked for examples of what I did to warrant a bathroom schedule, she couldn't give them anything concrete. She just made vague claims about my inconsideration and how I didn't respect her routine. One committee member asked what my routine was, and Jenna went quiet for a few seconds before saying she didn't know. I pulled up the photos of the receipts on my phone and passed it around the table. $5 for leaving a dish in the sink for more than an hour. $10 for forgetting to lock the door. $20 when my alarm woke her up at 7 in the morning. The committee members looked shocked as they scrolled through the images. Griffin pointed out that charging fines isn't legal between roommates. Jenna insisted it was just a system we agreed to, a way to maintain accountability. I laughed out loud before I could stop myself. The sound echoed in the quiet room. I told them I never agreed to anything, that Jenna just started charging me and threatened to kick me out if I didn't pay. Brandon stood up from his seat in the audience. He told the committee that he'd witnessed Jenna's boyfriend Mateo living in the apartment full-time, while I needed 48 hours written notice to have anyone visit. He said Mateo was there every single time he came over, eating food from the fridge, using the shower, sleeping in Jenna's room. Other students in the audience started nodding. A girl I recognized from my biology class raised her hand and said she'd tried to visit me once without the notice, and Jenna wouldn't let her in the apartment. Jenna's face got even redder and she started tapping her foot rapidly against the floor. I opened the voice memo app on my phone and found the recording from 3 months ago. I hit play, and Jenna's voice came through the speaker. She was telling me that she gave me the wrong Wi-Fi password on purpose because I was using too much bandwidth streaming videos for class. Her recorded voice sounded annoyed, almost proud of what she'd done. The committee members' faces changed completely. They looked genuinely shocked now instead of just concerned. One of them asked Jenna if she understood that sabotaging my internet access could have affected my grades and academic standing. Jenna opened her mouth, but nothing came out for a few seconds. Jenna's whole strategy shifted right then. She started attacking my character instead of defending her rules. She said I was disorganized, irresponsible, and impossible to live with, which was why she needed such strict rules in the first place. She told the committee that I left messes everywhere, never cleaned up after myself, and had no concept of shared space. Her voice got louder and faster as she talked. But then Isabel raised her hand from the audience. She stood up and told the committee that she'd worked with me on multiple group projects, and I was actually very reliable and organized. She said I always met deadlines, kept detailed notes, and was one of the easiest people she'd ever collaborated with. Other students nodded again. The housing director spoke for the first time since the debate started. She asked to see Jenna's violation notebook. Jenna hesitated, holding the notebook against her chest. The director asked again, and Jenna slowly handed it over. The director opened it and started flipping through the pages. Her expression changed as she read. She went from neutral to concerned to almost angry. She made notes on her clipboard while she read, her pen moving quickly across the paper. The room stayed completely silent except for the sound of pages turning. Jenna sat frozen in her chair, watching the director read through 2 years of documented complaints. I showed the committee one more photo. This one showed my designated storage area in our apartment. One small shelf in the fridge that barely fit a carton of milk and some leftovers. One cabinet in the kitchen that could maybe hold 5 boxes of food. I swiped to the next photo showing Jenna's locked cabinets taking up the rest of the kitchen. Layla asked how I was supposed to store groceries or cook meals with such limited access. I told them that was exactly the point. Jenna wanted me to feel like I didn't belong in my own apartment. She wanted me to know that everything was hers, and I was just allowed to exist in the tiny spaces she gave me. The committee members started whispering to each other. Griffin leaned forward in his chair and looked straight at Jenna. He asked if she thought her management style would work for all student housing. Jenna sat up straighter and nodded without hesitating. She said clear rules and real consequences create harmony in shared spaces. She said students need structure and accountability to live together successfully. Her voice sounded confident, like she truly believed what she was saying. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved or spoke for what felt like forever. I watched the committee members exchange glances with each other. Their faces showed something between concern and alarm. Layla's eyes were wide and her mouth was slightly open. The housing director stopped writing on her clipboard and just stared at Jenna. I realized they were finally understanding what I'd been trying to explain. They were seeing that giving Jenna power over other students would be dangerous. She didn't want to help people live together peacefully. She wanted control and the authority to enforce her vision of how things should be. Griffin cleared his throat and said they would move to closing statements. Jenna went first again. She talked about structure and organization, and how important it was to have clear expectations. She held up her roommate handbook and called it a model for successful shared living. She said students needed guidance and leadership to navigate the challenges of communal spaces. Her voice was steady, but I noticed her hands shaking slightly as she held the handbook. When it was my turn, I stood up and looked at the committee members. I talked about respect and equality. I said living with someone shouldn't feel like being controlled by them. I said everyone deserves to feel safe and valued in their own home. I explained that good housing policies protect students from exactly the kind of treatment I'd experienced. I said we needed leaders who understood that power should never be used to make others feel small or trapped. My voice got stronger as I talked. I wasn't reading from notes or trying to sound impressive. I was just saying what I actually believed. When I finished, the applause started immediately. It was loud and sustained and way more enthusiastic than the polite clapping Jenna had received. Students in the back row stood up. More people joined them until most of the audience was on their feet. I felt my face get hot and my eyes started burning with tears I refused to let fall. Walking back to our apartment felt like moving through a dream where everything looked normal, but nothing felt right. Jenna walked about 10 feet ahead of me. She wouldn't turn around or slow down or acknowledge I was there. The silence between us was different from all the other silences we'd shared. Before, her quiet had been a tool she used to make me feel guilty or wrong. This silence came from her having no control left. She was the one who felt powerless now, and I could sense her anger like heat coming off pavement in summer. Her shoulders were rigid and her footsteps hit the sidewalk harder than necessary. We reached our building and she yanked the door open without holding it for me. I caught it before it slammed in my face. She took the stairs 2 at a time even though we lived on the 3rd floor. By the time I got to our apartment door, she was already inside with her bedroom door shut. I stood in the living room looking at all her charts and rules still taped to various surfaces. They looked different now. Before they'd seemed official and intimidating. Now they just looked sad and controlling and kind of pathetic. I texted Brandon asking if I could stay at his place. He responded immediately saying of course and that he'd order pizza. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed in clothes for tomorrow and my laptop and phone charger. My hands were shaking as I packed. I kept glancing at Jenna's closed door, expecting her to come out and confront me. The apartment felt dangerous in a way it never had before. All those months of living under her rules, I'd felt trapped and controlled, but not actually unsafe. Now I didn't know what she might do. I'd humiliated her in front of everyone who mattered on campus. I'd destroyed the image she'd spent years building. People like Jenna didn't just accept that kind of defeat quietly. I left quickly and texted Brandon that I was on my way. His apartment was only a few blocks away. When he opened the door, he gave me a hug without saying anything. We sat on his couch and ate pizza straight from the box. He put on some action movie, but I couldn't focus on it. My brain kept replaying the debate. The look on Jenna's face when people started applauding for me. The committee members' expressions when they realized what she was really like. I wondered if I'd gone too far. If exposing her that publicly was cruel or necessary or both. Brandon noticed me staring at the TV without actually watching. He asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know. He said I did the right thing, and that Jenna needed to be stopped before she got real power over other students. I wanted to believe him, but part of me still felt guilty. My phone buzzed early the next morning. It was a text from Isabel. She said everyone was talking about the debate. She said most people were shocked because they never realized what Jenna was doing to me. She said several of our mutual friends felt bad for not taking my complaints seriously before. She said they thought I was just being dramatic about normal roommate stuff. Now they understood it was actually serious. I read the message 3 times. Part of me felt relieved that people finally believed me. Another part felt angry that it took a public spectacle for anyone to care. I'd tried telling people before. I'd mentioned Jenna's rules to friends casually, testing to see if they thought it was weird. They'd always laughed it off or said roommate situations were complicated or suggested I was being too sensitive. Now suddenly everyone was concerned and supportive. I texted Isabel back thanking her for letting me know. She asked if I was okay and if I needed anything. I said I was staying at Brandon's for now. She offered to bring me coffee later before class. I said that would be nice. I had to go back to the apartment eventually to get my stuff for class. Brandon offered to come with me, but I said I'd be fine. I wasn't sure that was true, but I also didn't want to seem scared of my own roommate. The apartment was quiet when I unlocked the door. Jenna's bedroom door was still closed. I walked into the kitchen to grab a granola bar and stopped. The refrigerator was bare. All of Jenna's typed rules were gone. I looked around and saw that her charts had been taken down from the walls too. The living room looked strange and empty without her color-coded schedules and violation tracking systems. I opened the cabinet where I kept my food. My one designated shelf was still there, but it looked bigger now somehow. The whole apartment felt different without her control systems visible everywhere. I realized how much physical space her need for dominance had taken up. Even when she wasn't in a room, her presence had been there in all those rules and charts and posted expectations. Now it was just a regular apartment with regular walls and regular cabinets. I grabbed my textbooks from my room and was heading toward the door when Jenna's bedroom opened. She stood in her doorway wearing pajamas and her hair was messy like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and puffy. She looked at me and said I betrayed her trust. She said I took private roommate issues and made them public. She said I ruined her reputation on campus and destroyed everything she'd worked for. Her voice got louder as she talked. She said we could have worked things out between us, but I chose to humiliate her instead. She said I was vindictive and cruel, and that I'd made her look like a monster when all she'd tried to do was create structure. I felt my anger rising as she spoke. I told her she ruined her own reputation by treating me like a prisoner in my own home for 2 years. I said her rules weren't about structure, they were about control. I said she made me feel small and wrong and trapped every single day. I said I didn't betray her trust because she never trusted me in the first place. She just wanted to dominate me. My voice was shaking, but I kept talking. I told her that other students deserved to know what kind of person she really was before giving her power over their housing. She stood there staring at me with her mouth open. Then she turned around and went back into her room and slammed the door hard enough that pictures rattled on the walls. I left the apartment and my hands were shaking, so badly I could barely lock the door behind me. I was sitting in the library trying to study when someone tapped my shoulder. It was our RA. She asked if we could talk privately. We went to one of the small study rooms and she closed the door. She said she'd heard about the debate and wanted to check on me. She asked if I felt safe in my apartment. I didn't know how to answer that. She sat down across from me and said she needed to be honest about something. She said she'd received complaints about my living situation with Jenna over the past 2 years. Multiple complaints from different people who'd noticed something was wrong. But every time she tried to follow up, Jenna made it sound like I was the problem. Jenna would show her the rules and explain that I was difficult and disorganized and that she was just trying to maintain basic standards. The RA said she was sorry for not investigating more carefully. She said she should have talked to me directly instead of just accepting Jenna's version of events. She said she felt bad about it now. I told her it was okay, but honestly, I felt kind of angry. How many people had noticed something was wrong but decided to believe Jenna instead of checking on me? The RA asked again if I felt safe. I said I wasn't sure. She pulled out some papers from her folder. The RA explained that I could request an emergency housing transfer if I needed to move out before the semester ended. She said normally there were fees and complications, but given the circumstances, the housing office would waive everything. She handed me the paperwork and said, just knowing I had options made something tight in my chest loosen. For 2 years, I'd felt stuck because breaking the lease would cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. Jenna had known that too. She'd known I was trapped and she'd used that knowledge to tighten her control. Now I had a way out that wouldn't destroy me financially. I took the papers and thanked the RA. She gave me her personal cell number and said to call if anything happened or if I felt unsafe. She said she'd be checking in more regularly from now on. After she left, I sat in the study room and looked at the transfer paperwork. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Brandon showed up at the library with coffee and asked how I was doing. I showed him the housing transfer papers. He said that was great and asked if I was going to apply. I said probably, but I wanted to document everything in the apartment first. He asked what I meant. I explained that Jenna might try to blame me for damage or claim I broke things when we moved out. I wanted proof of the current condition of everything, especially all her control systems. Brandon immediately understood. He said we should go do that right now while Jenna was probably in class. We walked back to my apartment and I unlocked the door carefully, listening to make sure nobody was home. The apartment was empty. Brandon pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. He photographed the locked cabinets in the kitchen with their combination locks still attached. He took pictures of the plastic box around the thermostat that only Jenna had the key for. He photographed my tiny designated areas, one shelf in the fridge and one small cabinet, compared to all the space Jenna controlled. He took pictures of her locked bedroom door and the bathroom schedule still posted inside the bathroom. He documented everything methodically while I stood there watching. He said I should email these photos to myself right now, so I had them saved in multiple places. I did that while he took more pictures. He suggested I might need this evidence if Jenna tried anything when we eventually moved out. I realized he was right. This was exactly the kind of thing Jenna would do. I walked back to Brandon's place after taking all those photos, and my phone buzzed in my pocket. Mom's name lit up the screen. I answered, and she immediately asked if I was okay, if I felt safe, if Jenna had done anything after the debate. Her voice had that worried edge that made my chest tight. I told her I was fine, that I was staying at Brandon's tonight just to be careful. She said she'd been watching my social media and saw people posting about the debate. She said she was proud of me for finally standing up to Jenna, but she kept asking if I needed to come home for a few days. I told her I couldn't miss classes right now. Then she said something that surprised me. She offered to help me break the lease early if I needed to get out. She said we'd figure out the money somehow, even though I knew we didn't really have it. She said my safety mattered more than a lease penalty. I felt tears starting and had to look away from Brandon, who was pretending not to listen. I told Mom I'd think about it, that the RA had given me some options too. She made me promise to call her every day until this was sorted out. After we hung up, Brandon handed me a slice of pizza and didn't ask questions, which I appreciated. The next morning, I woke up to 17 text messages. Most were from people I barely knew saying they'd heard about the debate. Walking across campus to my morning class felt weird because people kept stopping me. A girl from my sociology class came up and said she had no idea what I was dealing with. She said Jenna always seemed so organized and reasonable, like she had everything together. A guy I recognized from the library said his roommate freshman year did similar stuff, and he wished he'd spoken up like I did. Between classes, I checked the student government website and saw they'd posted an announcement. The housing committee would make their decision within a week. I screenshot it and sent it to Brandon. He replied saying the campus gossip was heavily in my favor based on what he was hearing in his classes. Isabel texted asking if I wanted to study together later, and I said yes, because I couldn't go back to the apartment yet. I sat through my afternoon lecture barely paying attention, thinking about how many people apparently knew something was wrong but never said anything. When class ended, another student came up and asked if I was the girl from the housing debate. She said her friend lived in my building and had heard Jenna screaming at me through the walls multiple times. I didn't know what to say to that. That evening, I finally went back to the apartment to grab some clothes and books. I unlocked the door carefully, listening for any sound of Jenna. The apartment was empty and dark. I flipped on the lights and noticed immediately that some of her stuff was gone. Her laptop wasn't on the coffee table where she usually kept it. Her favorite jacket wasn't hanging by the door. I walked into the kitchen and realized I could actually use it without checking the time. It was past 8. I opened the fridge and pulled out ingredients for a sandwich, using the counter space that had been off limits for 2 years. I made food slowly, deliberately, spreading everything out just because I could. Then I adjusted the thermostat to 72 degrees, a temperature Jenna never allowed because she said it was wasteful. The apartment started warming up and I actually felt comfortable for the first time in forever. I took a shower at 10 p.m., standing under the hot water for 20 minutes without worrying that Jenna would turn off the heater or pound on the door. The freedom felt strange, almost uncomfortable, like I didn't know what to do with it. I realized Jenna must be staying at Mateo's place to avoid me. The apartment was mine, actually mine, for the first time in 2 years. Isabel came over the next afternoon with her biochemistry textbook and a bag of chips. We spread out on the living room floor, something I never could have done when Jenna declared it a quiet zone whenever she wanted. Isabel kept looking around like she expected Jenna to appear and start enforcing rules. I told her Jenna was basically living at Mateo's now. Isabel opened her textbook but then just stared at me instead. She said I seemed different, that I was smiling more. She said I looked relaxed in a way she'd never seen before. I hadn't realized how tense I always was until I didn't have to be anymore. We actually studied for an hour without me jumping at every sound or checking my phone to see if Jenna was texting me some new violation. Isabel said something that stuck with me. She said I was acting like a normal person, instead of someone constantly waiting for the next rule or punishment. I thought about how much energy I'd been spending just trying to avoid conflict, trying to be invisible in my own home. We ordered pizza and ate it in the living room, and I didn't worry about cleaning up immediately, or putting everything back exactly how Jenna wanted it. Isabel laughed at something on her phone, and the sound felt too loud, and then I realized that was okay now. Loud was allowed. Existing was allowed. My phone buzzed with an email notification 2 days later. The housing director wanted to meet with both me and Jenna to discuss our living situation regardless of the election outcome. The email said the debate had raised serious concerns about power dynamics in our apartment. It said the university had a responsibility to ensure all students had safe housing. I read it 3 times, not quite believing it. This wasn't about the election anymore. This was about what Jenna had actually done. I forwarded the email to my mom and to Brandon. Mom called immediately and said this was good, that it meant the university was taking it seriously. Brandon said I should document everything I could remember before the meeting. I started writing down incidents I hadn't included in my debate presentation, things I'd almost forgotten because they'd become normal. The time Jenna locked me out of the apartment for coming home 10 minutes past my allowed entry time. The time she threw away my groceries because I'd put them on the wrong shelf. The time she changed all the door codes and didn't tell me the new ones for 2 days. I filled 6 pages in my notebook before the meeting. The meeting was in the housing director's office, a small room with uncomfortable chairs and motivational posters about community living. Jenna arrived exactly on time wearing her professional outfit, the one she used for presentations. She sat as far from me as possible and didn't look at me once. The housing director was a middle-aged woman with glasses and a stack of folders on her desk. She thanked us for coming and said she wanted to discuss some concerns that had come up. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said Jenna's behavior constituted harassment and creating a hostile living environment, which violated university housing policies. Jenna's head snapped up and she started to argue. She said she was just trying to maintain order, that I needed structure, that her rules were reasonable. The director held up her hand and cut Jenna off. She said control and order are not the same thing. She said charging fines, restricting access to common areas, and sabotaging internet access went far beyond roommate disagreements. She said these were patterns of abusive behavior. Jenna's face turned red and she started talking faster, trying to explain each rule, but the director kept interrupting her with specific policy violations. I sat there watching Jenna's carefully constructed justifications fall apart under actual scrutiny. The director turned to me and said she was offering an immediate transfer to a different apartment with no penalties or fees. She said I could move out as soon as I wanted and the university would cover any costs. Then she turned back to Jenna and said she strongly suggested Jenna attend mediation training and counseling about healthy roommate relationships. Jenna looked furious, her hands clenched on the armrests. She asked what would happen if she didn't do the training. The director said calmly that the alternative was removed from university housing entirely. Jenna agreed through gritted teeth. I accepted the transfer immediately. The director handed me paperwork and said I could start moving whenever I was ready. She said someone from housing services would help me if I needed it. Walking out of that office felt like stepping into different air. Jenna stormed off toward the parking lot without saying anything. I stood on the steps and called Brandon. I started packing that same afternoon. Brandon and Isabel showed up with boxes and tape. We worked through my room systematically, and I felt lighter with every box I filled. Isabel found some of my stuff that Jenna had confiscated over the years, hidden in the back of the hall closet. My favorite mug that Jenna said I'd lost. Books Jenna claimed I'd left in common areas. Even the homemade cookies my mom had sent. Stale now, but still in their container, hidden behind Jenna's winter coats. Brandon carried boxes down to his car while Isabel and I wrapped dishes and folded clothes. We were laughing about something stupid, making jokes about Jenna's ridiculous rules, and I realized this was the first time I'd ever had friends over without feeling anxious. We ordered Chinese food and ate it sitting on my floor surrounded by half-packed boxes. Brandon did an impression of Jenna presenting her handbook at the debate, and Isabel laughed so hard she choked on her noodles. Moving out felt less like an ending and more like finally starting something I should have had all along. My new apartment was smaller, and the furniture was definitely older. The couch had a stain on one cushion, and the kitchen cabinets didn't close quite right. But it was mine. Nobody else had keys. Nobody else made rules about when I could cook or shower or have friends over. I sat on that stained couch the first night after Brandon and Isabel left, and I just breathed. The silence felt different here. Not oppressive or controlled, just quiet. I could hear my own thoughts without constantly monitoring for Jenna's footsteps or listening for her disapproval. I got up and adjusted the thermostat to exactly the temperature I wanted. I opened the fridge and put my food wherever it fit. I took a shower at 11 p.m. just because I felt like it. Then I made tea and sat back on the couch and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this calm. The absence of constant watching, the absence of judgment and arbitrary rules, felt like something physical lifting off my shoulders. Griffin called 3 days later. I was in my new apartment organizing my bookshelf when my phone rang. He said he had news about the election. The student government had announced the results. I won the housing president position by a significant margin. Griffin said the committee was unanimous in their decision after seeing how I handled a difficult situation with grace and evidence-based arguments. He said they were impressed by how I documented everything and presented it clearly instead of just complaining. He said they thought that kind of careful attention to detail and fairness was exactly what student housing needed. I thanked him and hung up, then sat down on my couch because my legs felt shaky. I'd actually won. Not just escaped from Jenna, but won something I worked for. My phone started buzzing with congratulations texts from people I barely knew. Brandon sent a gif of someone celebrating. Isabel sent 3 exclamation points. My mom called crying happy tears. And I looked around my small apartment with its old furniture and stained couch and felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years. I felt proud of myself. The next morning, my phone buzzed while I was making coffee in my new kitchen. Jenna's name lit up the screen with a text message that stretched across multiple bubbles. She said I stole the position through manipulation and lies. She said everyone would eventually see through my victim act. She said I was a snake who betrayed her trust and ruined her reputation for my own gain. The words kept coming, accusation after accusation, claiming I was too incompetent to handle the responsibility and that I'd fail spectacularly within a month. I read through the entire message twice, feeling my stomach tighten with each sentence. 2 years ago, I would have responded immediately, defending myself and trying to explain. I would have apologized for making her look bad even though she did that herself. But I'd learned something during those 2 years of walking on eggshells and documenting every interaction. Engaging with her only fed the cycle. She wanted a reaction, wanted me to argue so she could twist my words and play the victim herself. I took a screenshot of the entire conversation instead, saved it to a folder on my phone labeled evidence, and set my coffee cup down on the counter without any coasters or designated placement rules. The silence in my apartment felt different now, peaceful instead of oppressive. The housing director's office was on the 3rd floor of the Student Services building. I'd only been there once before when I filed a complaint about Jenna that went nowhere. The director sat behind a desk covered in housing applications and policy manuals. She smiled when I walked in and gestured to the chair across from her. We spent an hour talking about roommate conflicts and power imbalances. I explained how Jenna's control tactics escalated gradually over 2 years until I didn't recognize how bad things had gotten. The director took notes while I described the thermostat locks, the bathroom schedules, the illegal fines, and the Wi-Fi password sabotage. She asked questions about warning signs and intervention points. When did the behavior start becoming problematic? What would have helped me recognize it sooner? How could RAs identify these patterns before they escalated? I suggested clearer reporting mechanisms that didn't require students to prove their roommate was deliberately harming them. Monthly check-ins for all shared living situations instead of waiting for complaints. Training for housing staff about gaslighting and emotional manipulation tactics. The director wrote everything down and said she'd been thinking about policy updates for months, but needed a student perspective to make them effective. She asked if I'd be willing to help draft new protocols, and I said yes, immediately. Brandon texted me that afternoon saying he was throwing a celebration dinner at his apartment. When I arrived that evening, Isabel was already there along with 5 other friends from our major. Someone had ordered pizza and hung a banner that said "Congratulations" in crooked letters across the living room wall. People kept raising their drinks and toasting to my courage. They asked how I stayed sane for 2 years living under Jenna's control. I sat on Brandon's couch with a paper plate balanced on my knee and admitted there were times I thought I was the problem. Times when I believed maybe I really was as difficult and chaotic as Jenna claimed. Times when I wondered if other people would think her rules were reasonable and I was just being dramatic. Isabel put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Gaslighting is hard to recognize when you're living through it." She said Jenna spent 2 years convincing me that my perceptions were wrong and my reactions were inappropriate. Brandon added that isolation is part of how controlling people maintain power, and everyone around the room nodded in agreement. They told stories about noticing I seemed stressed or withdrawn, but not realizing how serious the situation was. One friend said she thought I was just busy with classes. Another said she assumed I was naturally quiet and didn't want to intrude. The guilt in their voices made me realize how effectively Jenna had separated me from my support system. But they were here now, celebrating with me, and that mattered more than the time we'd lost. I ran into Mateo outside the library 3 days later. He was walking toward the entrance while I was leaving with an armful of books for my research paper. We both stopped when we saw each other and the awkward silence stretched between us. Then he said he wanted to apologize. He said he'd been thinking about how he lived in our apartment rent-free for months while I was charged fines for leaving dishes in the sink. He said he realized now how messed up the whole situation was, and he should have spoken up. I shifted the books in my arms and told him I appreciated that. He explained that Jenna made everything seem so reasonable at the time. She'd say I was difficult to live with and needed structure, and he believed her because she seemed so organized and put together. He said he feels guilty for benefiting from her double standards without questioning them. I told him that's how manipulation works. It makes the unreasonable seem logical, until you step back and look at the whole picture. We talked for a few more minutes about how Jenna's doing now, and he admitted their relationship is strained because she won't stop complaining about how I ruined everything. He said he's starting to see the patterns I tried to warn him about. We said goodbye, and I walked back to my apartment thinking about how many people Jenna convinced that I was the problem. My phone rang that evening while I was studying at my kitchen table. The RA from my old building was calling to tell me she was implementing new check-in procedures for roommate situations. She explained that learning what happened with Jenna and me made her realize how easy it is to miss controlling behavior when the person doing it seems responsible and organized. She's requiring monthly one-on-one meetings with each resident now instead of just responding to complaints. She's asking specific questions about who controls shared resources, whether both roommates feel comfortable in common areas, and if there are any rules that only apply to one person. She wants to catch these patterns earlier before they escalate to the level I experienced. I thanked her for taking action, and she apologized for not seeing the signs sooner. She said Jenna was always polite and helpful during floor meetings while I seemed stressed and withdrawn, so she assumed I was just struggling with school. She didn't realize the stress came from my living situation. We talked about warning signs and red flags, and I promised to send her the notes from my meeting with the housing director. The next week, I started working on a proposal for a roommate bill of rights. I sat in the campus coffee shop with my laptop open and drafted a document establishing baseline expectations for shared living spaces. Every resident has the right to access common areas without permission or schedules. Every resident has the right to adjust thermostats and use appliances without locks or restrictions. Every resident has the right to have guests over with reasonable notice, not 48-hour written requests. Every resident has the right to access Wi-Fi and utilities without interference. No resident can charge fines or penalties to another resident. No resident can create rules that only apply to their roommate. I included a section about reporting procedures that didn't require students to prove deliberate harm before getting help. I added language about early intervention and mediation services. The document grew to 12 pages by the time I finished. I sent it to the housing director, and she responded within an hour saying she loved the idea and wanted to present it to the administration. She asked if I'd be willing to speak at the next housing committee meeting to explain why these protections were necessary. I said yes, even though the thought of talking about Jenna's behavior in front of more people made my stomach hurt. 2 weeks later, the housing director called me into her office again. She closed the door and told me something in confidence. Jenna had dropped out of her mediation training after only 2 sessions. The counselor running the program said Jenna refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing and spent both sessions blaming me for being too sensitive and making everything difficult. She insisted her rules were reasonable and necessary, and she couldn't understand why everyone was treating her like she'd done something wrong. The housing director said this confirmed her concerns about Jenna's ability to recognize power imbalances and unhealthy relationship patterns. I wasn't surprised, but I felt relieved knowing I didn't have to deal with her anymore. The director assured me that Jenna wouldn't be allowed to hold any housing leadership positions until she completed the full mediation program and demonstrated understanding of healthy roommate dynamics. She asked how I was adjusting to my new apartment, and I told her it felt like I could finally breathe. My midterm grades came back the following week, and every single one had improved from the previous semester. My sociology professor gave me an A on my research paper and wrote a note saying my analysis was thorough and well supported. My statistics grade jumped from a C to a B+. Even my hardest class showed improvement. I stared at the grades on my laptop screen and realized how much energy I'd been spending just surviving my living situation. Now that I wasn't constantly stressed about apartment rules and could access Wi-Fi whenever I needed it, I actually had mental space for studying and assignments. My sociology professor stopped me after class one day and commented that I seemed much more engaged in discussions than I was earlier in the semester. She said my contributions were thoughtful and showed I was really thinking about the material instead of just going through the motions. I thanked her and didn't mention that the difference was sleeping in an apartment where nobody monitored my every move. Isabel and I started having lunch together twice a week between classes. We'd sit in the student union with sandwiches and coffee and talk about everything from assignments to weekend plans. She told me one afternoon that she noticed something was wrong last year but didn't know how to help. She said I always seemed anxious and withdrawn, like I was carrying weight nobody else could see. She wanted to ask what was going on, but worried about overstepping or making things worse. We talked about how isolation is part of how controlling people maintain power. Jenna made me feel like my problems weren't serious enough to bother anyone with. She made me doubt my own perceptions until I stopped trusting myself enough to reach out. Isabel said she'd pay attention now if she saw similar patterns in other friendships. She promised to speak up if someone she cared about started showing those same signs of isolation and self-doubt. Having this conversation made me feel less alone in what I'd experienced. It also made me realize how important it is to check in with people even when they say everything is fine. The student newspaper contacted me 3 days before finals week asking for an interview about the Housing President campaign and my policy proposals. The editor explained they wanted to do a feature story about student advocacy and the Roommate Bill of Rights. I stared at the email for 20 minutes trying to decide whether to respond. Part of me wanted to move on and stop making my experience with Jenna so public. But another part knew that sharing my story might help other students recognize controlling behavior in their own living situations. I called Brandon to ask his opinion and he said I should do the interview. He said my experience could prevent someone else from spending 2 years thinking they were the problem when really they were being manipulated. He reminded me that several students had already reached out privately to thank me for speaking up at the debate. I agreed to the interview and scheduled it for the following week after my last final exam. The interview happened 2 days later in a small conference room at the student newspaper office. The reporter was a junior named Noah who seemed genuinely interested in the policy side of things rather than just drama. I spent most of the hour talking about the Roommate Bill of Rights proposal and how it would create clearer reporting systems for students in bad living situations. He asked about my experience with Jenna, but I kept those answers short and focused on what I learned rather than specific details. The article came out 3 days after that with a photo of me standing outside the housing office. The headline read, "New Housing President Advocates for Roommate Rights," in bold letters across the top of the front page. The article explained the policy changes I was proposing and included a sidebar with information about resources for students dealing with controlling roommates or domestic situations. Brandon texted me a picture of the paper with 3 fire emojis and the words, "You're famous now." My email inbox filled up within hours of the article being posted online. Students I'd never met were sending me messages about their own roommate situations. A sophomore named Amy described how her roommate monitored her phone calls and got angry if she talked to family too often. Another student explained that his roommate had created a point system where violations led to having belongings thrown away. Someone else wrote about a roommate who installed cameras in the common areas without permission and reviewed the footage daily looking for rule violations. I read through every message that night sitting at my desk in my new apartment. Each story made me more certain that what happened with Jenna wasn't unique or rare. This pattern of control and manipulation was happening all over campus in different forms. I responded to each person with information about the housing office resources and encouragement to document everything. Some of them thanked me for speaking up because they thought they were overreacting or being too sensitive about normal roommate conflicts. Reading that made my chest tight because I remembered feeling exactly the same way for 2 years. My mom drove up that weekend and took me to dinner at an Italian restaurant off campus. We ordered pasta and sat in a booth near the back where it was quiet. She reached across the table and held my hand while telling me she was sorry for not taking my complaints about Jenna more seriously over the past 2 years. She admitted she thought I was just being dramatic about typical roommate annoyances like dishes in the sink or thermostat disagreements. Now, after reading the article and seeing the documentation I'd collected, she understood it was actually psychological abuse disguised as organization and structure. She said she felt guilty for all the times she told me to just try harder to get along with Jenna, or suggested that maybe I was being too sensitive about the rules. I told her it wasn't her fault because Jenna was good at making everything sound reasonable when you heard it secondhand. Mom squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me for finally standing up and using what happened to help other students avoid the same situation. The housing director called me into her office on Monday morning. She had my Roommate Bill of Rights proposal printed out with notes written in the margins. She told me the document was exactly what the university needed, and that she was scheduling it for presentation to the Student Affairs Committee next month. The director explained that having a student voice leading this initiative made it much more powerful than if administration just imposed new rules from the top down. She asked if I'd be willing to present the proposal myself at the committee meeting and answer questions about why these protections were necessary. I agreed immediately, even though public speaking usually made me nervous. This felt too important to let fear stop me from participating. She walked me through the committee process and explained what kind of questions they might ask. Before I left her office, she thanked me for turning a painful personal experience into something that could create real change for future students. I started seeing Jenna around campus occasionally after that. The first time was outside the library when I was walking to meet Isabel for lunch. Jenna was coming down the steps with a group of people from her major, and our eyes met for just a second before she looked away and steered her group in a different direction. It happened again near the student union, and then outside the science building. Every time she saw me, she would immediately change course or find a reason to look at her phone until I passed. Part of me felt guilty watching her avoid me like I was some kind of threat. I wondered if I'd gone too far by exposing everything so publicly and destroying her reputation. But mostly I felt relieved that I was free from her control and that the policies I was proposing might protect other students from ending up in similar situations. The guilt was real, but it was smaller than the relief. Brandon found me studying in the library one afternoon and slid into the chair across from me. He asked if I'd thought about running for student government vice president next year. He explained that my housing advocacy work had gotten attention from campus leaders, and several people had mentioned my name as a strong candidate. I stared at him for a minute, trying to figure out if he was joking. The idea that anyone would trust me with more responsibility seemed impossible after spending 2 years believing I was incompetent and irresponsible, because Jenna told me so constantly. Brandon could see my doubt, and he reminded me that I'd just won an election, created meaningful policy proposals, and earned respect from the housing administration. He said the person Jenna convinced me I was didn't actually exist. I told him I'd think about it, but I wasn't making any promises. He grinned and said that was good enough for now. I made an appointment at the campus counseling center the following week. The therapist was a woman in her 40s named Dr. Anderson, who specialized in relationship trauma and emotional abuse. I spent the first session just explaining what living with Jenna had been like and showing her some of the documentation I'd collected. Dr. Anderson listened without interrupting and took notes occasionally. When I finished talking, she told me that what I experienced was textbook gaslighting and emotional manipulation. She explained that Jenna's behavior wasn't about my failures or shortcomings, but about her need for control over her environment and the people in it. Dr. Anderson said that recognizing abuse doesn't make someone weak. It actually takes strength to see the pattern and name it for what it is. We talked about how manipulation works by making the victim doubt their own perceptions until they stop trusting themselves. She gave me homework to practice trusting my own judgment about small decisions without second-guessing myself constantly. I left that first session feeling lighter somehow, like someone had finally confirmed that I wasn't crazy or oversensitive. The Student Affairs Committee meeting happened 3 weeks later in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the administration building. I wore the professional outfit my mom had bought me for interviews and brought printed copies of the Roommate Bill of Rights for all 12 committee members. The housing director introduced me and explained the background of the proposal. Then I stood up and presented each section of the document, explaining why specific protections were necessary based on real situations students had experienced. The committee asked questions about implementation and enforcement. They wanted to know how disputes would be handled and what consequences would exist for violations. I answered everything as clearly as I could, using examples without naming specific people. After 40 minutes of discussion, the committee chair called for a vote. The proposal passed with only minor revisions about the appeals process. The housing director told me afterward that implementation would begin next semester, and that I'd created meaningful change that would protect students for years to come. I felt proud in a way I hadn't felt since before Jenna convinced me I was incapable of doing anything right. Isabel knocked on my apartment door that evening with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine she'd somehow convinced someone to buy for us. She had news about housing assignments for next year. We were both staying in university housing, and she'd requested me as her roommate on her application. The housing office had approved the request, so we'd be living together starting in the fall. We sat on my couch eating lo mein and talking about what our apartment would be like. Isabel suggested we sit down together and create an actual mutual agreement about shared spaces, chores, and expectations. We both started laughing at how different that felt from Jenna's one-sided rule system, where I had no input and everything was designed to control me. Isabel promised that if I ever did something that bothered her, she'd just tell me directly instead of creating elaborate punishment systems. I promised the same thing. We spent the rest of the evening looking at furniture online and planning how we'd decorate our new place. The student leadership conference was held at a hotel downtown 2 months later. Universities from across the state sent representatives to present on various topics related to campus life and student advocacy. I'd been invited to give a presentation about recognizing and addressing power imbalances in shared living situations. My session was scheduled for Saturday morning in a medium-sized conference room. I expected maybe 20 people to show up, but the room filled completely with over 60 students, RAs, and housing administrators. I presented for 30 minutes about warning signs of controlling behavior, the psychological impact of living in manipulative environments, and institutional responses that could protect vulnerable students. The response was overwhelming. People asked questions for another 20 minutes after my presentation ended. Multiple universities requested copies of my Roommate Bill of Rights to adapt for their own campuses. Several RAs told me they wished they'd had this training earlier because they'd dealt with situations they didn't know how to handle. A housing director from another school gave me her card and asked if I'd be willing to consult on their policy development. I left that conference feeling like the painful experience with Jenna had turned into something genuinely useful that could help students I'd never even meet. My academic advisor called me into her office during the last week of classes to discuss my performance that semester. She pulled up my grades and participation records on her computer screen, comparing them to previous semesters. My GPA had jumped almost a full point, and she'd received positive feedback from 3 different professors about my class contributions. She asked what had changed, and I found myself explaining the housing situation and how escaping it had affected everything. She listened carefully, nodding as I talked about finally being able to focus on schoolwork without constant anxiety. She said she'd noticed a difference in our meetings too, that I seemed more confident and willing to advocate for myself when discussing my academic goals. I realized she was right. I'd started speaking up more in class, volunteering for group leadership roles, and actually believing I had valuable ideas to contribute. The person Jenna had convinced was incompetent and chaotic had disappeared, replaced by someone who trusted her own judgment again. Graduation happened on a sunny Saturday in May, and I sat in the audience watching Jenna walk across the stage to receive her diploma. She'd be moving off campus immediately, taking a job in another city 3 hours away. The relief I felt was huge, knowing I wouldn't randomly run into her at the coffee shop or library anymore. That evening, Brandon showed up at my apartment with a cake that said Freedom Party in bright blue frosting. He insisted we needed to celebrate properly, so we invited Isabel and a dozen other friends who'd supported me through the campaign and aftermath. We crowded into my small apartment, eating cake and telling stories about the most ridiculous of Jenna's rules. People kept toasting to my courage, but it felt less like courage and more like finally reaching a breaking point where staying silent hurt more than speaking up. The housing office hired me as a summer intern to help implement the new roommate policies. I spent my days creating training materials for RAs, developing screening questions to identify controlling behavior early, and drafting guidelines for intervention procedures. The housing director would review my work and offer suggestions, but mostly she let me run with my ideas. She said I had a natural talent for this kind of work, that my personal experience combined with my advocacy skills made me uniquely qualified. One afternoon, she suggested I consider student affairs as a career path, maybe even graduate school in higher education administration. The idea hadn't occurred to me before, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I wanted to help students who found themselves in situations like mine, who needed someone to believe them and help them escape. Fall semester started with me moving into a new apartment with Isabel. The space felt completely different from the old place, lighter somehow, even though the layout was similar. We unpacked together, deciding jointly where things should go instead of one person declaring rules. We cooked dinner side by side in the kitchen, laughing when we discovered we both hated doing dishes but loved cooking. Friends came over without elaborate advance notice, staying late into the evening without anyone checking the time or enforcing quiet hours. When Isabel accidentally used my shampoo, she just apologized and offered to replace it. I told her not to worry about it. We had an actual conversation about a minor issue instead of one person creating a punishment system. The apartment felt like a home instead of a prison, a place where I could relax instead of constantly watching my behavior. The new Roommate Bill of Rights officially went into effect that semester, and I helped lead orientation sessions for incoming students. I stood in front of groups of 50 or 60 freshmen, talking about healthy shared living expectations and warning signs of controlling behavior. I explained the difference between reasonable household agreements and one-sided rule systems designed to maintain power. After each session, students would come up to thank me, some of them sharing their own experiences with difficult roommates. Several said they hadn't realized their situations were problems until hearing me describe the patterns. One girl told me her roommate had installed a lock on the thermostat and charged her fines for violations, exactly like Jenna had done to me. I gave her information about reporting mechanisms and resources, watching relief spread across her face as she realized she had options. I ran into Mateo outside the library one afternoon in October. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, like he wasn't sure if I'd want to talk to him. But he stopped anyway and told me Jenna was having problems in her new apartment. Her roommates wouldn't tolerate her control tactics, and she'd been complaining constantly about how disrespectful and difficult they were. Mateo said she'd tried implementing her rule system during the first week, and her roommates had laughed at her before telling her they'd split household decisions equally, or she could find somewhere else to live. She'd called him crying multiple times, insisting her roommates were being unreasonable and refusing to respect her need for structure. Mateo said he was starting to see the pattern I'd tried to tell him about back when we were all living together. He apologized again for benefiting from the double standards without speaking up. I told him I appreciated the apology, and we talked for a few more minutes before going our separate ways. Brandon came over to my apartment one evening in November to watch a movie. We were halfway through when my phone buzzed with an email notification. A student from another university had read about my roommate advocacy work in an article about student housing reforms. She was living with a controlling roommate who monitored her food intake, restricted her shower times, and charged her fees for minor infractions. The email was long and detailed, describing 2 years of manipulation that sounded painfully familiar. I paused the movie and spent the next hour crafting a response. I validated her experiences, explained that what she was describing was harassment and abuse, and provided resources for reporting and getting help. I included information about documentation and institutional channels she could use. Brandon read over my shoulder as I typed, and when I finished, he said I was really good at this. I realized he was right. I could use my experience to help other students who felt trapped and alone like I had. The housing director called me into her office in early December with a job offer. She wanted to create a paid position as a student advisor for roommate conflicts, and she thought I was uniquely qualified for it. The role would involve meeting with students experiencing difficult living situations, helping them document problems, connecting them with resources, and advocating for policy changes when needed. She said my personal experience combined with my policy knowledge made me perfect for the work. I accepted immediately, feeling excited about having a job that felt meaningful and directly helped other students. The position would start in January and continue through graduation, with possibility of extending it if I stayed for graduate school. My therapy sessions had shifted focus over the past few months. We spent less time processing the trauma of living with Jenna, and more time building healthy relationship skills and maintaining boundaries. The therapist said I'd made remarkable progress in recognizing my own worth and trusting my perceptions instead of accepting other people's narratives about me. She pointed out how I'd stopped second-guessing myself constantly, how I now spoke up when something bothered me instead of assuming I was overreacting. She said the work I was doing to help other students was also helping me heal, that using my experience constructively had transformed it from just pain into something purposeful. I left each session feeling stronger and more confident in my ability to handle whatever came next. Isabel and I hosted a dinner party at our apartment in mid-December, inviting 10 friends to celebrate the end of the semester. I cooked pasta while Isabel made salad, and we set up a makeshift table using our desks pushed together. People arrived throughout the evening, bringing wine and desserts and filling our small space with conversation and laughter. Halfway through dinner, I realized I hadn't thought about Jenna's rules even once. I wasn't worried about using the kitchen at the wrong time or having too many guests or making too much noise. This apartment felt like mine in a way the old one never had. I was genuinely happy, surrounded by friends in a space where I could be myself without fear of punishment or judgment. Isabel caught my eye across the table and I smiled back, grateful for everything that had changed. I started working on graduate school applications in January, filling out forms for student affairs programs at 8 different universities. The personal statement took me 3 weeks to write because I kept trying to find the right way to explain how living with Jenna taught me to recognize power imbalances in shared spaces. I wrote about documentation, about speaking up when something feels wrong, about how institutional policies can either enable abuse or prevent it. My advisor read my draft and said it was compelling, that admissions committees would see I had real experience to back up my interest in housing advocacy. I submitted applications to programs in Massachusetts, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and 2 in California, hoping at least one would accept me. The student newspaper contacted me in February asking to do a follow-up article about the Roommate Bill of Rights. They wanted to interview students who had used the new reporting system during fall semester, and apparently several of them specifically mentioned my story as the reason they felt brave enough to come forward about their own situations. I met with the reporter at the campus coffee shop, and she showed me quotes from 3 different students talking about controlling roommates, unfair rules, and feeling trapped in their living situations. One student said reading about my experience made her realize that what her roommate was doing wasn't normal conflict, but actual harassment. Another said he didn't know there were official channels for reporting problems until he saw the new policies I helped create. The article ran with the headline about successful implementation and included statistics showing that reported roommate conflicts had increased, but were being resolved faster with better outcomes for everyone involved. My mom drove up for Parents' Weekend in March, and we went to dinner at the Italian place near campus. She kept looking at me across the table with this expression I couldn't quite read, and finally she said I seemed completely different from the person she talked to on the phone during those 2 years with Jenna. She said I used to sound tired and defeated all the time, like I was constantly apologizing for existing, but now I spoke with confidence and actually smiled when I talked about my work and my friends. She told me I seemed more like myself than I had since starting college, more willing to take up space and express opinions without second-guessing everything. I hadn't realized how much I'd changed until she pointed it out, how much lighter I felt now that I wasn't constantly monitoring my own behavior to avoid violating arbitrary rules. I sat in my apartment one evening in late March working on supplemental materials for graduate programs, and I found myself thinking about how close I came to accepting Jenna's version of reality, where I was the chaotic, irresponsible problem. If she hadn't run for housing president, if I hadn't found the courage to apply and present my evidence publicly, I might still be living in that apartment believing I deserved to be controlled and punished. Speaking up at that debate changed everything. Not just for me, but for other students who needed someone to name what controlling behavior actually looks like in shared living situations. I felt proud of who I'd become through this experience. Proud that I turned something painful into something that helped other people escape similar situations. I was excited to keep doing this work in graduate school, to keep advocating for students who needed someone to believe them and help them recognize that they deserved better than what they were accepting.